Welcome to Talking to Thinkers, John.
Thank you very much, Johnny. I'm very glad to be on your podcast along with your other guests.
Great. Well, John, if we can begin at the beginning of your life, can you describe your childhood?
Yes, I was born in 1948 in the northeast of England in a working class family, in a working class community. And that was really shaped my view of things quite deeply, because that community and that world disappeared, started to disappear in the 60s and had pretty well disappeared entirely in the 70s. And excuse me. And that gave me a sense of the evanescence of forms of life, as Wittgenstein would call them, whole societies, whole worlds, which remained with me to this day and informed quite a lot of my work over the last 50 years.
And can you say something about your parents, or did you have siblings, or what sort of community that, as you say, kind of disappeared?
Well, it was a street community and an intergenerational community. Families of several generations lived together, if not in the same house, then very, very nearby. My siblings were also working class children, and it was a close community. And the urban, what's often considered an urban myth of it being safe, was not mythical. It was true. Doors were left open at night. There was very little theft or random violence, and it was in some ways a limited community for women and others, and it was an established practice for men to leave the community either by joining the army or the navy or the merchant marine, or by leaving to emigrate to other countries, or indeed, in some cases, as in mine, to go on through education, to leave and live elsewhere. But it was a way of life which certainly by the 80s had completely vanished as a result of a variety of factors, one being the continuing decline of the traditional industries that supported it, shipbuilding, coal mining, and so on. But a second, and this influenced my way of thinking as well, was very extensive and bold and well-meaning housing policies, in the course of which the actual physical streets in which these communities lived were demolished, and the residents were moved out to orbital estates, as I was for a while, on the edge of town. And though that led to produced considerable increases in material comfort, outside loos became inside loos. There was central heating. There were all the modern conveniences. People were broken up. The communities, the families became more segregated, in the sense that older people lived in different parts of these estates, and there was a fairly rapid increase or appearance, because there hadn't been hardly any before, of vandalism, graffiti, and that kind of thing. So that led me to the view, even then, I'm talking now about the early 60s, when I started thinking about these matters, or mid 60s, that well-intentioned sweeping reforms, not to speak of revolutions, could have unintended consequences, or unexpected consequences that were actually quite damaging. So I, right from the start, although I was in those days, remained for a long time a Labour voter, as soon as I could vote, and I, even to this day, regard the Labour settlement of 1945 to the mid-70s as a very benign settlement. I did have on the basis of that experience, of the disintegration of these communities, I did have a deep-seated suspicion of far-reaching reforms and revolutions, even though, of course, they're sometimes unavoidable.
Mm-hmm. Well, that gives a nice insight into the sort of community you were brought up in. And you did mention there that, the tendency was for men especially to move out of the community to get alternative work. And you've also indicated someone into education. So, and that's what you ended up doing. Can you give some account of the kind of education you got?
Well, it was all within different parts of the state system. I for a while I attended a school in a mining village for several years, and every single male in that village who didn't go down the mines, or every single male in that village who didn't join the armed forces or the merchant marine or something like that, went down the mines. This was in the 50s. They were still functioning at that time. And I think I was the only one who went on to any kind. I went on after that, after a few years, to a state secondary school. The mining village was on the edge of town. I went into a state secondary school and took what will be familiar to your British listeners as the 11 plus exam, which meant that I was given different curricula and prepared for the possibility of university, and eventually went to Oxford in university. It was admitted to Oxford University in 1968. I wasn't alone in that. I missed out a crucial feature there as a result of the should be explained to your foreign listeners, which is that after the age of 11, having taken this exam, I went to a grammar school, a state-funded grammar school, which is described as a grammar technical school. And in that school, at that time, there was a regular stream, quite small, maybe 6 or 7 a year. It was an all-male school at that time. I'm talking about the 60s. The schools were gender segregated, as well as being selective in terms of examination performance. And in that school, every year, some boys went to Oxford or Cambridge and to other universities, and I was one of those boys. So that wasn't at all unique. It was not common, but it was a standard practice at that time. And had it not been for the grammar school, I probably would have remained in the Northeast, and I probably would have had an entirely different life.
Yes, and interestingly, in your latest book, The New Leviathans, you mentioned a teacher you had, I think, at the grammar, Charles Constable, who you...
Yes.
Can you say something about him and why he was so inspiring?
Well, I'll be happy to. One feature which your younger listeners in this country or your foreign listeners in America and elsewhere should be aware of is that at that time in Britain, there was nothing like a national curriculum imposed by the government in Westminster. Teachers in state schools, as much as in private schools, taught what they wanted. And Charles Constable, who was my history teacher and was very interested in political ideas. He was very interested in political writers and theorists. He'd read widely himself. And he introduced us to R.G. Collingwood's book. R.G. Collingwood, the Oxford Roman historian, but also political theorist, called The New Leviathan, singular. He introduced us to that, and it's a strange, challenging book about civilization and barbarism, presented in little kind of numbered gobbets of thought, but he introduced us to that demanding book. We would then be about 17, I suppose, or 18 years old. In the sixth form, the level of the school from which one goes on to university, if one does. And I found that a very thought-stirring experience, and I admired him enormously for his passion for ideas and his dedication to introducing us in these boys from the Northeast, mostly from modest or backgrounds, to the world of ideas. I thought it was a wonderful thing, and I still do. So in a way, this book of mine, The New Leviathans, is a homage to him. It's a way of saying thank you.
Very good. So, I mean, intellectually, you were a curious. You got an interest in ideas as a teenager. I mean, temperamentally and socially, what can you remember what you were
Well,
like?
I was extremely bookish. I mean, the place I haunted more than anywhere else when I wasn't at school was the local municipal library, which was an extremely good library, actually, in those days. This, I say, it's the mid to late 60s. I went to Oxford in 1968, as I already mentioned. And it had a tremendous amount of Edwardian fiction, which I read along with other works, with works in philosophy and history and so on. That meant people like H.G. Wells, Thomas Hardy, Joseph Conrad, who became one of my abiding literary loves. I read them all first there. And there were plenty of, I forget how many books you could take out, a dozen or something like that, that were at any one time. The shelves were well stocked. And that was a part of this, if you like, the funding for that and the fact that it existed was a part of the labor settlement from 1945 to the mid 70s, when it began to break down, as we'll no doubt discuss later. That opened, along with Charles Constable in the grammar school, opened windows to anyone who wanted really to look out of them. You only had to join the library. It was free. Get a ticket, and you could use it as much as you like, which I did profusely. And so I was very bookish and remained like that. And so that when I went on to Oxford, I apart from taking tutorials, I didn't actually change my way of life all that much. I had a completely different social environment, of course, but I continued to read. I wasn't unusual in this. I attended very few lectures in Oxford. I think in 3 years, possibly about half a dozen. They were voluntary. A lot of people didn't attend them. I didn't bother either. I read the books for my tutorials in college with my tutors. But apart from that, I continued to read widely. So I was, before I went to Oxford, after I went to Oxford, I've remained a bookworm all my life.
So, as you say, you won a place in Oxford, which, as you say, was quite an achievement, even though it wasn't completely unique.
No, it wasn't unique. I got as a bit of a help, I got what was called an exhibition, which was a bit of extra money, and that meant that I think it was an extra £40 a year. It sounds nothing now, but in the late 60s, it was significant. That meant I didn't have to work or borrow money, which is a fundamental difference between then and now. Of course, at that time, I should mention two things which I think are significant. One is that the overall percentage of the population that went to universities was a tenth of what it is now. It was about 5%. Now it's about 50% in this country, in Britain. But in Oxford, for example, the percentage of people from manual working class backgrounds like mine was much, much higher than it is now. It was about 20% or more, chiefly because of the grammar school system. So I wasn't alone there. There were quite a few people from my background, including actually 3 or 4 from my hometown, who I knew before we went to Oxford and knew in Oxford, and know some of them to this very day. So it was a completely different environment to now, where far more people go to university, but the numbers who go to what are considered the Russell group, the so-called elite universities, the proportion from these backgrounds is actually much lower.
Oh, that's interesting. So, because I was going to ask you, like, as a working class boy from Shields, Oxford must have been at least socially intimidating, or maybe foreign, but that was not necessarily the case then.
No, not really, because there were friends of mine there in other colleges who I did see. But there was another feature at that time. This is 1968, a kind of culturally iconic year. But I think things had been like this in Oxford for a few years. It was an extremely laissez-faire environment. As long as you attended most of your tutorials and did a little bit of reading, you could do exactly what you liked. You could. There was no attempt to impose any kind of intellectual orthodoxy on anyone. There was a certain way of doing Oxford philosophy that you'll be aware of, Johnny. You know, the so-called Oxford analytical tradition, which was really a style rather than a doctrine. It was a way of writing and thinking which prized clarity. And actually, I benefited from that, I think, to some extent. Perhaps that's immodest to say, but I've always striven to write clearly ever since. But in terms of imposing any view of the world, a progressive view, a conservative view, there was actually no attempt whatever to do that. There was a wide variety of views were represented among the tutors. There were conservatives, old-fashioned Tories, liberal, what would now be called liberal Democrats, Marxists, all views were nearly all views were represented, I would say. There are no Nazis, thank God, but apart from that, pretty well everything. And it was the social environment was very relaxed, extremely relaxed. And so I found it quite easy to. I just went on, I'm afraid, doing exactly what I wanted to do. And I was freer to do it, of course, up there because in Oxford, because one could get to London quite easily. I went on one or two demonstrations. I was present at the big 1968 demonstration against the Vietnam War in London, and others. So I got to know lots of people. You could found university societies or take part in them. And that I did actually quite a bit. I joined I had eclectic interests even in those days, and I joined the Oxford University Society for Psychical Research, parapsychology. And of course, one of my books, as you'll be aware, Henry, the Immortalization Commission, is about half of it. It's a diptych of Soviet and Edwardian English themes. Half of it is about psychical research in England in the Edwardian period. And so I met quickly met a wide variety of very interesting people. While at the same, who I hadn't met before. While at the same time, there were others who had come from the north. So it wasn't really as intimidating as within days of getting there. I really felt quite natural.
And just to, what was your degree in?
TPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. I had actually gone up to do something else. I went up to do philosophy and physiology, but when I got there, I found that if I was to pursue that, I would have to do experiments on pigeons, spinning them around, and whether out of squeamishness or some other feeling about inflicting pain on other species, I didn't want to do it. So I went to my college, and as they always were, they were very helpful. They said, well, why don't you do PPE instead? That'll be interesting for you, philosophy, politics, and economics. And so I started the next week, I think, doing that. And that was what I did, and I enjoyed that very much. As I say, I got a background in Oxford philosophy, including philosophical logic, Frege and Russell, and all that kind of thing. Very useful, very illuminating, and also the general background. Did some economics, and my economics tutor there was a witty man called Walter Eltis, and he one of the first things he said, if you'd come here a few years ago, I would have taught you a load of nonsense. Because I believed in those days in, I forget what it was, but now I think that's all utter nonsense. I'm going to teach you what I believe in now. And that was, as I say, that was wonderful. There was no attempt anywhere in Oxford by the faculties or anywhere else to anybody else to impose any orthodoxy within disciplines or in general. And that I mean, that of course is, I've actually outlived two vanished worlds. One is the world of Northeast working class life, which was a beautiful world. It was a hard world in some ways. It had some harsh features, but it was a beautiful world. That's gone, and I've now that vanished in the as I say, the 70s, by the 80s certainly. And then there was the world of Oxford, not only Oxford, I think it would have been similar in Cambridge and other British universities for that matter, of unfettered intellectual pluralism, where you could explore ideas without any constraint. That's gone too. And so I guess in that respect, I'm somewhat unusual, certainly in having not suffered a lot, because if you'd lived in most of Europe and lived through vanishing worlds, you would have suffered terribly. The Jewish world disappeared in Eastern Europe. Whole ethnicities moved around in the 20th century, and when forms of life disappeared in continental Europe and other parts of the world, it was usually violently. In Britain, they just faded away, and I was not harmed at all. On the contrary, I benefited. But I did experience, I did learn. I'd left university life in 2007, before the emergence of a kind of censorious, what I call hyper-liberal orthodoxy, or sometimes called woke. So I never suffered from any of it at all, actually. I just went on doing what I wanted to do. But I did see two worlds disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also affected my way of thinking.
Well, yes, and I'd like to maybe come back to that theme later on in the interview, especially the changing fortunes of university life.
Yes.
Where we've now a growing intolerance of genuine diversity of opinion.
Yes.
But going back to that time when you were starting off, were there any particular figures? Because you obviously did well at Oxford, you did an undergraduate degree, and then you did a doctorate. So academically, you were successful. And during that period, maybe, who were the key figures that had an impact on your
well, in my undergraduate life, someone who's I got on, I think, well with all of my tutors. They were very interesting people. But I was helped by one in particular, a man called Norman Crowther-Hunt, who later, it was my politics tutor, who later became Lord Crowther-Hunt and worked in the Wilson government, I think. And he was from a background very similar to mine. He'd come from a comprehensive school, but had become an Oxford tutor, a fellow in politics, and worked extensively with civil servants and governments. And he was always very friendly to me. So I always felt grateful to him. He wasn't an intellectual influence, though. The big intellectual influence was after I finished my undergraduate degree and went on to do a doctorate on primarily on John Stuart Mill, but secondarily on John Rawls. And at that time, I think in 1972, I think it would have been, I met Isaiah Berlin, and he, of course, as you know, I mean, Johnny, having written 2 books on him yourself, and so on, and you will have read my book on him. He was an enormous influence on me. We didn't, and I don't now share everything. We didn't share, but his pluralism, his doctrine of conflicting basic human values, even if some human values are universal, which he believed, and I believed at least some human goods and bads are universal. That's to say, generically human. They conflict with each other, so there's no one way of life which maximizes them all to the best extent. There are different ways of life which emerge from resolving their conflicts in different ways. And so that was a fundamental insight, but he also opened my eyes and ears to other realms of thought. He introduced me, as I mentioned in the acknowledgements of the book, to Russian thinkers, late 19th century Russian thinkers. And I started reading them, and that was a profound influence, which went on until he died, if I remember rightly, in, was it 1997, Johnny?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. So I knew him for 25 years thereafter. He was never my formal tutor, by the way, formal supervisor. I had John Plamenats for a while as my supervisor, and a couple of others after that, working on Mill. But I did see him quite not frequently, but regularly every year for long conversations. Thereafter, and after, from 1972 onwards, in 1973, I got my first academic position at the University of Essex. Very interesting place to be at that time, and I was there till 1976. And when I returned to Oxford as a fellow in 1976, I resumed in fact, I saw him while I was in Essex as well, but came back now and then. But I continued to see him regularly for the rest of his life.
Okay, interesting. So before we maybe talk about some of your ideas, as we go into the 1970s and early 1980s, you know, it was a time of major change.
Absolutely.
In the world and in Britain. Can you maybe set the landscape then? What you thought were the really notable changes politically and socially?
Well, you're absolutely right, Johnny. It was a big change, and I was very much aware of it, and it affected my intellectual life and my the books that I wrote. As I say, I went to Essex in '73, and Essex at that time was a center of student radicalism, and there was a period in I think it was '74 when the students there blockaded the university from oil, from heating oil. They wanted to sort of impose a blockade on, and did do this for actually several months. Blockaded the university by overturning lorries in the underground car park and taking the wheels off and things like this. And so it was to stop heating oil coming in. So I lived on campus, so for 3 months, we all went, 3 or 4 months, we all went about, I did anyway, especially since I lived there, in thick jumpers. It was an almost, struck me even at the time, a slightly Chekhovian scene. We were all going around bundled up and so on. They also wanted to shut down the lectures, which didn't happen. I just went to mine regardless. They of what they said, and some others did, many others did the same. So it was a period of student radicalism. But for me, I was in a sense radicalized, but in the opposite direction, because it struck me absolutely contrary to what they and their academic supporters, a lot of my faculty with whom I was on friendly terms, a lot of them were supported the students in this. They thought that this was a period in which Britain and other parts of the world would advance towards socialism or some post-capitalist economic and political order. I thought that was a complete fantasy. I thought that what was happening then, starting in the early '70s, going on into the mid '70s, was the breakdown in Britain of the post-war settlement from which I had benefited so much, and which I think has been in many ways very humane, although it did have, as I've already mentioned, these negative features that I noticed living and experienced actually in the Northeast, that with the new housing clearances, often with all their material benefits, damaged, sometimes terminally damaged, the communities that they were supposed to serve. So I thought from '73, '74 onwards that settlement was declining. And one of the reasons I thought that, there was a variety of reasons. One was that while I lived on the campus during this period of no heating oil. And by the way, I learned then something that I think, a fact that most people outside of war zones don't learn. I learned how many kettles of water you need to boil to put a small amount of hot water in the bath. It's far more than you think, far more numerous. So you have to keep at it, as it were, to get any few inches of water in the bath. But I lived there, and in the evenings, I used to go to. I lived on. There was some faculty housing in tower blocks on the campus, and I lived in one of those. In the evening, I used to often go to the library, and it was an excellent library, very well stocked library. In social sciences particularly, and I was often alone. I mean, I would put the lights on and switch them off and so on. And one night I was sitting there, it's really exactly how it happened. I noticed a book called The Constitution of Liberty by F.A. Hayek, the Austrian economist and philosopher. I sort of pulled it down and started reading it. And it struck me then as a brilliant book. I think it's a sort of, but it's a kind of chaos of clear ideas, if you like. Each one, they didn't quite add up, I even thought then, but they were brilliant. And as I began to think about his ideas, I began to apply some of them to the British situation. And I could see what perhaps others in this at Essex couldn't see, that what was actually happening was the fraying of the and then the breakdown of the post-war settlement. And by 1976, that was evident because there was a tremendous amount of industrial conflict, but also I liked the 70s, by the way. I really enjoyed them. I liked the hard edge that they had. I even liked the conflict. But by then, I think the IMF was called in, I think, in 1976 to bail out the British economy. And it was then that the post-war settlement was just 3 years before the Conservative, before Thatcher came to power. It was then that Labour started dismantling under Tennessee the post-war settlement. The post-war settlement did not stop in 1979, as academic folklore has it. It stopped in from 76 or even earlier onwards. And if Labour had done other things, if they'd reformed industrial relations, if they'd listened to one of their great politicians, great figures, Barbara Castle, who produced in the early 60s a brilliant report called The End of Strife, arguing for extensive reform of trade union law. If they'd done that, there might very well not have been a Margaret Thatcher. Or certainly not as prime minister, and there wouldn't have been the period of Thatcherism. But they didn't do that, and perhaps they couldn't do that because they were too close to the unions at that time to. I mean, apart from Margaret Thatcher, Barbara Castle was the second most influential 20th century woman in 20th century British politics, but her ideas didn't bear fruit, and Thatcher came in, and from about 1973 onwards, 74 onwards, I was in touch with I could see that Labour couldn't make the necessary reforms. It was out of the game, basically. And I was in touch with various think tanks in London, and I didn't know her then, as I came to know her slightly later, but a little bit later. But I saw Thatcher, and I could see that there was going to be a fundamental change, not only in British politics, but eventually, although there were many chance features to her becoming leader of the party, it didn't have happened as it did. But once she became leader in 1975, the party changed utterly, fundamentally, and people in the party, of course, some of whom I knew, they thought she wouldn't last long. She would last a year and a half. There was a lot of gender and class prejudice against her as a grocer's daughter. That wasn't my intuition at the time. She was a very forceful person. She didn't originally have the ideas she later became identified with. Originally, she was quite a kind of conventional conservative, even rather pro-European, even on political grounds. But by the time she took over, she came under the influence of other ideas and other people. Keith Joseph, for example, a fellow of All Souls, who I got to know, and she acquired some ideas of the kind that were later called Thatcherism. And so a profound change occurred in British politics, which was very kind of comical and entertaining for me. My university colleagues later in Oxford, by then I was back in Oxford, but also in Essex, actually, were completely unprepared for. It came like a bolt of lightning out of a blue sky. But if you've been following it a little bit, and you've been following the turmoil of ideas in London, and also as I was, and as I did, and in the Conservative Party itself, you weren't surprised by it. I mean, she didn't start with a vast ideological program. For example, most people aren't aware that in her first election manifesto, privatization was only mentioned hardly at all. It was just in regard to, she wanted to reprivatize one or two things that had been nationalized by Labour, and I think there was one extra privatization of road haulage or something. It was very minor feature of. It wasn't a vast program. That of privatization that happened later under her watch, under her leadership, but it wasn't there to start with. But she had a view that of politics in which what was needed from time to time were these radical reforms. And of course, for me, I thought that it was inevitable. But I even relatively early on, I thought that it would have some negative effects, and that was based on my early experience in the Northeast. But big changes and even revolutions can't always be prevented. And in this respect, you see, I've never held to a meliorist view of history or a meliorist view of ethics or society. The meliorist view is that you can't achieve a utopia. You can't achieve perfection. In fact, I don't think there is. Human beings have any clear idea of perfection. We can come back to that later, but it can't be achieved. But you can step by step, you can improve the world, and so that what's achieved in one generation can be carried on to the next generation, and you can have this gradual, almost sedate, stately kind of progression. I never believed that for a single moment. And so I thought that revolution or discontinuity, or what in Darwinian biology is called punctuated equilibrium, was the way history works, the way the human world works, which is that something's achieved, sometimes it's an improvement, it's a benefit, it lasts, if you're really lucky, maybe a couple of generations, then it breaks down, and it doesn't break down. You don't go, if you are at stage 5 on the melioristic escalator, it doesn't go back to stage 4. It often goes back to stage 1 or 0 or even -1, as it did in Europe with the Nazis and in the Soviet Union with Bolshevism. If you actually look at history in ethics and politics, or if you like, in civilization, quality of civilization, melioristic progress is very rare and doesn't last very long. It's almost unknown in most of the world. So it's just an illusion. And yet it's one in which people who think themselves terribly sober, terribly sagacious, terribly, they believe in. And we can come back later to why that might be. But it's not realistic. So that in the late 70s, early 80s, what I thought was that Britain would go through a period of fairly profound change, because I knew that although she wasn't going to change everything overnight, she wasn't going to privatize everything overnight, for example. She didn't listen, for example. She met Hayek, or by then I knew quite well. She listened to F.A. Hayek, but never accepted his advice on anything. And I know there are letters between them where she categorically rejects some of his ideas for dramatic overnight economic change, so they would be destabilizing. She's not going to do them, and she didn't do them. She didn't privatize the health service, although There were people in the think tanks who told her that she should. Later on, well, rather sort of, I thought, interestingly, she said she wouldn't privatize the Royal Mail because the Queen's head was on the stamps.
Mm.
It was wonderful. So she didn't do all of those things, although over time she became more set in her thinking. And that was what eventually toppled her. One of the things that eventually she didn't do any of these things, but she was going to completely change the post-war Keynesian paradigm, which Dennis Healy had already started dismantling in 1976. She was going to take this radically further. So the whole pattern of British economic policy and government, and even of universities eventually, would be changed quickly. And as I say, it was to me a source of almost infinite amusement, although after a while it became rather tedious, to watch my academic colleagues look at all this in complete disbelief. Because back that it could happen at all, and that it was happening around them, when as I say, at least in Essex in the early 70s, they were confidently expecting, or at least hoping, for a move towards socialism. Exactly the opposite happened. It was capitalism red in tooth and claw for a decade, and I think that was partly because of a feature of the university life, which was strong then, has become much stronger since then, which is that they only talk to each other, or they primarily talk to each other, academics, and wrote for each other, and they were primarily writing to. It was less so then than now, much less so actually, but it was definitely a feature that they formed their view of the world, of the events going on around them, including the political events, not on the basis of direct acquaintance with any of the politicians or a wider range of ideas in think tanks and other contacts, but by talking to each other and writing articles in academic journals and counter arguments and so on. And that, of course, I thought then was a kind of collective solipsism. It meant that when you'd miss most of the big events that are happening in the world, not that you can predict them, but they were already in, you can to a certain extent, I think, but very, very great difficulty. And it's partly chance, but that these changes were already happening in Britain. I mean, that was your first question: what was happening at the time of great change? They were already underway, but they didn't. The depth of their depth and the fact that a settlement, political settlement, was coming to an end, didn't percolate through to the academic world until after it had happened and they were directly affected.
Yes. Now, given that you see there, I mean, that's a nice microcosm of your view of history, which you tend to see as you say, a series of discontinuities,
Yes,
rather than a story of progress.
yes,
And the Thatcher's succession,
or even of decline, rather than a story. Put it like that.
Exactly. So, can you be forensic? And also, did you welcome Thatcher, or did you just find this is interesting, regardless of whether I welcome it or not, and this is what I need to focus on?
Well, it was both. I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, that was where the intellectual energy was. It was not in the universities at that time. There were probably in Britain at that time about a dozen, or at most 24 public, open Thatcher academic supporters of Thatcher. Probably not, and I knew most of them. There are probably a couple of dozen. The rest were either horrified or hostile or indifferent. Well, hardly anywhere indifferent. They were mostly strongly hostile. Sorry, just repeat your question again, Johnny.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when given the way you look at history as a story, as a series of discontinuities rather than in this more,
you said, does it help me to be more forensic?
Forensic, and if you are more forensic, can you also take a normative view, or like that? Oh, well, Thatcher was a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes. Well, it was both for me, because yes, that was what I was going to say. First of all, Thatcherism, or what was then called the New Right, which was what later called the neoliberal right, or the free market right, was where the intellectual energy was. And but there's another background fact about that period, which is very relevant to me. It was one of the reasons I did support Thatcherism. I wasn't interested in it purely as a phenomenon, an historical or intellectual phenomenon, which was that we're talking the 70s and 80s now, which was we were in the Cold War, and I was then a militant and strong anti-communist throughout the whole period, an active anti-communist throughout the whole period, and so was Thatcher. So I mean, I thought communism was a tremendously repressive system, but I wasn't alone in that. But more unusual, I thought it could collapse. And one of the reasons for that was actually from Hayek, because although I even then had doubts about some aspects of his version of liberalism, he was unparalleled. He was unmatched as an analyst, a theorist of why socialism, in the sense of comprehensive economic planning, doesn't work, and and will never work. His argument was that knowledge is dispersed in society in countless millions and millions of people. It's often local, it's often ephemeral, and it's often not even articulated. It's in habits and practices and ways of responding to events that can't be collected together and put into some central economic plan, and that any attempt to do that would have catastrophic consequences, and which would include enormous waste and, of course, corruption. And that was, I still believe that Hayek's account of why socialism doesn't work is the best account. It's an epistemic as much as anything else, epistemological, the limits of human knowledge, of gathering together all this ephemeral, often local information, often not articulated in theories, tacit knowledge, what Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, called it, means that there are insuperable limitations, even I think perhaps in the era of artificial intelligence, to doing that. So that to me was a very profound. It still is a very profound analyst. Unfortunately, he used to often say the attempt to achieve socialism has profound negative unintended consequences. He didn't understand that the attempt to resuscitate the free market, to free up the free market again, also has profound unintended and negative consequences. He never got that far, never grasped that. And neither did his followers, his disciples, many of whom I got to know. And I wrote a book about him, as you know, on Hayek's philosophy, 2 editions, which he liked very much, and I got to know him very well in the 80s. He stayed in my college when he came to Britain. I talked to him at enormous length. I should say my interests were not entirely political. I was also interested in the historian of ideas in the early 20th century history of Central Europe, and I think the very first question I ever asked him was, did you ever talk to Karl Kraus, the Viennese aphorist and writer? And he said, no, but I saw him walk into a cafe. But he also, I mean, he was a relative of Wittgenstein and wrote a short kind of biographical. He didn't really understand the later Wittgenstein at all, but he talked to Wittgenstein in the First World War. I think they ended up in the same railway carriage for a while. They were both socialists then, by the way, and including Hayek at that time. And they produced this this short biography of about 20 or 30 pages. He gave me a copy long before it was published, and so I was interested in his responses to Wittgenstein and this other vanished world of Central European thought that he'd lived in and grown up in, and that was actually that was what I talked to him about when I first met him. More even, I would say, than about politics or economics. But later on, when I met him in various other contexts and talked to him in Oxford and so on, we did talk about that, and I knew I knew his views on what should be done in British politics, which I thought were, even compared with Thatcher, were much too dogmatic and doctrinal, let's call it, than that was reasonable and reflected his view in his encounter with Keynes, this great debate he had with Keynes in the 30s, which he lost. I mean, he thought that the depression could be resolved by basically spending less and letting the market go back to equilibrium. When Keynes replied it wouldn't go back to equilibrium, it could get more and more dislocated. Keynes was right, Hayek was wrong. But also, I think Hayek missed out. There was one sort of crucial thing he didn't understand about his own, even in his own experience, which is that profound economic collapses like that of the Depression invariably lead to regime changes, often very negative ones. I mean, his view was that if you have a liberal framework, of liberal institutions, which he described, I remember at the time almost laughing out loud when he said this. He said we could have this permanent framework of liberal institutions, and it would just stay there while the market resolved itself and got back into equilibrium. I thought, well, haven't you reflected on what happened in the 1930s in Europe? After all, he left Europe to come to Britain in the 1930s. Popper, great friend of his, went to New Zealand actually during that period. What you can learn from that is that when there's a huge economic convulsion, as there was after the Wall Street crash and its knock-on effects in Europe, then regimes are toppled and swept away, and that includes liberal regimes. In fact, there are no permanent frameworks, liberal or otherwise. That was one of the central illusions he was sort of stuck on. If you could get the framework right, and later, of course, thinkers like Rawls and others seem to think the same thing. If you get the framework right, it would survive anything. Utter nonsense. They're all fragile. They're all very fragile. And so in the debate between Keynes and Keynesian liberalism, if that's, and Hayek, I was even then on the Keynes side. I thought that during the 30s, I thought that would be disastrously bad advice from Hayek. And also when I knew Hayek, I thought that his advice, and I knew that Thatcher didn't take that advice. I knew that she did, that she rejected it out of hand, because as well as being, as she became certainly over time more and more an ideologue, she was an ideologue. She was also a practicing politician, and she understood politics pretty well throughout her period, better than most of her critics in Britain, until really her long period in power. I mean, it happens to almost all politicians, whatever if they're in power for 10 years or more, they lose a sense of reality, what Isaiah Berlin called a sense of reality, very profound observation, which is that sense of the broader society, its unspoken assumptions, the way in which it changes, people's attitudes, and which is what guides political action as much as any theory or more. She lost that after 10 years in power, and started to make mistakes, big ones, and wouldn't be corrected, including the poll tax, and which most of her cabinet were strongly opposed to. And I was as well at that time. I think that's on record. I thought it was a very bad idea. But she stuck to it even after she tried it out in Scotland, and it was a disastrous failure. She tried out an experiment. By the way, liberals like this are very like this now. They claim they're empiricists. That's what they always say. They're not. Liberalism is now a faith-based worldview. And so when something fails, like regime change in Iraq, it's not because it was a mistake. It was because you didn't do it consistently enough or radically enough. So what they do, liberals now, is they double up. Typically, they say, well, if we'd only done this, this, and this, and this as well, these wonderful consequences. Thatcher was like that towards the end of her period in power. She wasn't like that at the start. She was often cautious at the start. She was very often very cautious. I didn't know that well, but in private, she was very cautious. I should tell you an interesting, I've written about this before, so it's not completely new. It's sort of interesting anecdote which shows her attitudes and how she was both right and wrong in many ways. In the mid-80s, I think it must have been about 86 or say 87, I ended up alone with her after some meeting or other, and I'd heard that she was going to abolish tenure in British universities, which she then did. And I was opposed to that for reasons which I tried to explain to her. And I said, I believe you're going to abolish academic tenure in British universities. Yes, yes. And she brought universities, I think, within the scope of the Industrial Relations Act, so you could get rid of academics who weren't needed anymore, or even a full department, which you couldn't before, because before, very strong system of tenure in British universities. That wasn't so much a system, it's a set of practices, so that if one department closed down, quite often the academics would be moved to another university. So it was very, very strong. She abolished that. And I was opposed to that. And so I said to her, and I say I've written about this somewhere, I said to her, well, one of the reasons many academics oppose it, including many of your rather rare academic supporters in this country, is that it protects people with tenure, protects people with unpopular views which are unpopular in the academic community, and they can't be gotten rid of, so they're safe. And I said that's why she admired at that time all things American. So I said that's why in America there is academic tenure. In America, it protects people. That's why they're so keen on it in America. And she looked at me with icy, stony disdain, and I could see I was getting there. I didn't expect to change her mind, by the way. Once she might have dithered a lot, not about this, I think, but she might dither about things. Once she'd decided to do them, she just went ahead to do them. What it did them, she didn't listen to counter arguments after that point, and she decided to do this. I didn't have any idea about this. I didn't have any notion that I could change her view on this. But so I said, that is why, Prime Minister, your dozen or so academic supporters in this country are nearly all opposed to your policy on this in this regard, because they fear that they might be discriminated against if it happens, if you introduce it. And she looked at me with, as I say, icy disdain. I said, and I mean, she said, well, in that case, we'll win without you. And that was the end of the interview. And I thought that was tremendous. I thought it was sort of, it was sort of very stylish. It was what I sort of did. Now, she was right and wrong. She was right that she went on to for another 4 or 5 years. It didn't matter what anyone in the academic community thought about it. It didn't matter a damn what they thought. She had continued winning elections, and until she lost her grip at the end. So she was right about that. It didn't matter what a handful of academic supporters or even the academy as a whole matter. It's completely irrelevant. So she was right. She was wrong in another sense, though, because as we later found out, with the rise of a censorious illiberal liberalism or woke, people could be driven out of their positions. People could be demoted or never hired, and so on. If you have a system in which there's no strong academic tenure, then the position of then the situation of intellectual minorities and heterodox thinkers is much more vulnerable, much more exposed than it was under the old British system. Of course, there were many other changes happened as well, but so I think she was wrong about that. And I think what's happened now since then has sort of indicated my argument, which, as I say, was more of a performance than anything else, because I didn't think for a moment she would listen to me or at least take any notice of me. But I think I was right then, and she was wrong in that respect, even though when she said we'll win without you, she did go on to do that for several years.
Well, I mean, it wasn't an exact overlap, but the end of Thatcherism happened to coincide with the kind of end of the Cold War.
Yes.
The late 80s, early 90s, the fall of the Soviet bloc. And actually that was quite a defining moment, because it brought to a culmination some of the illusions you are quite critical of. In other words, there was this huge glorification of liberal capitalism, and that this was now going to become the kind of universal ideology.
Yes.
So if you can think back to, how did you see the fall of the Soviet bloc, even back in 89 to 91. What was your thoughts
Well,
at the time?
Well, as you may recall, Johnny, I wrote about it because I wrote a piece in October 1989 in response to Francis Fukuyama's first article, not the book. In the article, it was called "The End of History" with a question mark. In the book, the question mark disappeared. That was rather like, as I've said, Sidney and Beatrice Webb's book. The first edition of it was called "The Soviet Union: New Civilization." And then in the subsequent editions, they removed the question mark. That's true. It's a true story. It was rather like that. Totally deluded in both cases. And I published that before the wall went down. I mean, Fukuyama's article appeared in the American magazine, I think the National Interest, in the summer of 1989, and my piece came out in October 1989, and I've reprinted it unaltered in my book Gray's Anatomy, the collection of my essays, so anybody can read it there. What I said then, and what I said then in October 1989 was that this was not the end of history, in the sense that it was the resumption of history in the very traditional form, that the Cold War was a very anomalous period in modern history, in that it was a sort of binary conflict between two Enlightenment ideologies, liberalism and Marxism, and that most of human conflict in human history hadn't been about ideologies in this sense. They'd been about religion, ethnicity, resources, struggles for power, and so on. And that would start again, I confidently predicted, once this process of Soviet collapse was complete, which took another year or so, but by 1990 and so on, pretty well over 91. And so that's what I thought then. And of course, the background to that was there was some kind of biographical background that I mentioned, and also intellectual background. What Fukuyama meant by the end of history was what he called history with capital letters, Hegelian history. It's history as a succession of big ideas. Now, I don't think history, in the sense of history with capital letters, really exists. What there are successive and conflicting human anecdotes which struggle together to turn the events of history, the events of the human world, into stories. And some can be closer to reality than others, and in that sense more truthful. But there's no logic. There's no unfolding logic in history. It's often completely governed by chance or folly, or it's often, if there is a logic, it's completely absurd or mad. And the logic of history is situational, not universally. There are particular situations which, when you get into one, there's only a very limited range of options. So there's a logic in history in that sense. And at some point, there's almost inevitability, never quite. But that applies only to particular bits of history, not to history as a whole. So when I criticized Fukuyama, as I did then, and I had many debates with him and conversations in London and Beijing and other places, we got on very well. He's a very decent man, a very congenial man, but I thought then that he was completely wrong. By the way, he later said he was misinterpreted. I don't think that's really true. I was in the United States in 1989, 1990, in New York and Washington and elsewhere, and I know that that he was taken quite literally, and I believe he meant it quite literally when he said that big capital letter history, which is the big conflicts of ideology in the world, are over. That there's only one now, which, as you said, Johnny, earlier on, which is now going to be liberal capitalism, which was then called democratic capitalism. In other words, a highly idealized version of the American model. I thought it was completely ridiculous, but it was, and I wasn't the only person who thought that. I mean, even some politicians thought that. George Bush Sr., who'd seen action in the Second World War, he's a man with a sense of reality, like his son, said, "This is a wonderful triumph against communism, but things will be very difficult now." He said, "Things will be lots of conflicts which have been frozen or repressed will come out. It's going to be very difficult. So we should be. So he understood it. Nobody took the slightest notice of him, although he was a very respected figure. He was considered too pessimistic, and I was considered apocalyptically pessimistic. It was quite. See, I think the older I've got, the more I've been impressed by the sense of absurdity in human events. So back then, in 1989, 1989, I was saying history will go on as usual, as it was before the Cold War. That's what will happen. History will go on. People said, "Oh, that's apocalyptically pessimistic." I say, well, it's just always been like that. No, that's intolerable, unbearable pessimism. We'll all commit suicide if we believe that. Well, go ahead and do it. You rid the world of a tiny amount of its folly if you do that. They didn't, unfortunately. They went ahead. Then there were various sort of events then went on, and mistakes were made almost immediately after the fall of communism. The West imposed a system of shock therapy on the former Soviet Union, on post-communist Russia, which was socially extremely disruptive. They decontrolled prices overnight, and that led to huge price increases. And so a large section of the Russian population was impoverished, not just impoverished. Quite a lot of the older people died, actually, because life expectancy shrank in Russia for some years to lower than that of Egypt. So this sort of triumphalism from kind of day one was taken seriously, taken literally. And also in Washington at the time, I knew some of the people around the big foundations and so on who'd been funding foreign policy research during the Cold War. They cancelled their grants. They said, "We don't need them anymore. We've won." So I thought, this is a period of high comedy in human history, then of tragedy, and then again of absurdity. Because what then happened, as I say, is Russia recovered. There was a period of chaos, and Yeltsin, Putin got in originally then as a sort of authoritarian pragmatist reformer, installed a bit of order, but the liberal period, or the liberal, if there'd ever been one in Russia, was over, perhaps, for possibly forever in any measurable historical time span. And then the West went on to having damaged the what it should have aimed at in Russia was, I think, a moderate hybrid regime, which would retain some authoritarian features. Russia had never had a successful liberal era. It certainly couldn't be introduced through shock therapy in a few years. If there'd been any sense of reality at all, that would have been obvious. But then we had the triumphalism of the Iraq War, and again, where I was, which I again wrote about before the war happened. I wrote in the New Statesman. It's collected in a book of mine called Heresies. And it's also, I think, actually, it's also in Gray's Anatomy, which I said in the February of 2003, that if the war goes ahead, the consequence is likely to be the disintegration of the Iraqi state. And the reason I said that was for a perfectly clear, simple reason, which was that if you have a long-standing dictatorial regime, decades long, then it becomes the state. The state and the regime become indistinguishable. And if you demolish the dictator overnight, the risk is that the state will disintegrate. And that's exactly what happened in Iraq. But again, I was said to be apocalyptically pessimistic. This will work, or it could work to some degree. What happened was worse than what I thought, because what happened was ISIS. What happened was genocidal attacks on the Yazidi people. In other words, the situation became worse than it had been even under Saddam's terrible dictatorship. And this, again, if you had a little bit of a historical perspective, you weren't terribly surprised by this, because if you look back to how the state was founded, it was cobbled together by British civil servants, who understood that in the 1920s, who understood that it couldn't be democratic and never would be democratic, and even wrote to that effect then. There was never any prospect of the state of Iraq becoming a West liberal style democracy. Zero. So it was bound to end badly, but it ended even worse than I thought. And then even after that, everybody said we'll never do this again. They followed the liberal way of thinking, which is never to admit, never to learn from experience. This is what but to double up. They did the same thing in Libya. Had an even more catastrophic effect because the state could collapse completely, and that's one of the factors lying behind the European immigration crisis, because it's a gateway. It's basically there are at least two governments now, but basically governed by jihadist groups and human traffickers, people smugglers, in a context of anarchy, essential anarchy. When Western politicians say, as they always do now, that we've got to crack down on people smugglers, you've got to crack down on the who's going to do the cracking down in a country which has no state? It's one of the main gateways for this kind of activity. So it's had a lingering effect, this post-Cold War triumphalism, in deepening the anti-empirical character of liberal thinking, and that is it's even worse than I thought it would be, and by now I think it's incurable. I don't think there's any possibility of that, because it's become even hyper-liberal in the West. It's become even more unreal. Things now simply have to play out by a logic of events, but not an emancipatory logic as in Hegel, but a logic of absurdity.
Well, actually, it's interesting that after, in the 90s, because you mentioned, there was a kind of an absence of a sense of reality in this triumphalism, this triumphal optimism, if you like. And during this period, you write an important book on Isaiah Berlin.
Yes.
Who you could say embodied, or at least tried to express what a sense of reality is.
Very much
what,
so.
What it implies.
So
what was it about? What was it that made you write that book, that you felt, well, I need to say something about Berlin's ideas that is not obvious if you just read Berlin?
Well, I'd known him by then for, I suppose, about, as I say, about 20 years or slightly more. My book came out just a couple of years before he died, but I'd known him for a long time, and learned, as I say, an enormous amount from him. But I did think that he was wrong on one fundamental question, which was whether you could get a universal principles of liberalism from value pluralism. As you know, Johnny, that's the central argument of my book on Berlin, which is that pluralism, value pluralism, is the fundamental truth, and that there are many contexts in which that suggests a liberal regime, but you can't get from value pluralism a kind of a universal priority of choice or negative liberty or anything of that kind. You might get something of useful, which is useful because you might get it might exclude certain regimes which don't achieve any of the universal goods but embody an enormous amount of universal evils, and that's the 20th century totalitarian states did do that. They didn't achieve any of their goals. Certainly the communist ones didn't. The Nazi ones did almost achieve some of their goals, which are like of extermination. They didn't produce a higher human species, quite the contrary. So you might be able to get an anti-totalitarian argument. I think you can from Berlin, but not an argument for liberalism in certain circumstances and conditions, historical circumstances. You don't get an idea of liberalism as the single universally valid regime. I think that's inconsistent with the underlying argument, his underlying position of value pluralism. So what I took from Berlin was agonistic pluralism, the pluralism of ultimately conflicting human values, more than his liberalism. Although I still think that his idea of negative liberty is very important, and I'm actually more suspicious than I was then when I knew him of. I think he's more right than I then thought he was on the dangers of notions of rational autonomy as the core of freedom, because what that core of liberty, because what that does is it prioritizes a particular conception of rationality, which usually embodies a particular ideal. I mean, think of Rawls's rational life plans. What on earth are they? I mean, who actually lives by a rational life plan? And wouldn't the world be absolutely terrible if anybody did, or if large numbers did? So I tend to think he was right now, actually, about the importance of negative liberty being the core way in which we should think about liberty, rather than rational autonomy. But in terms of deriving, there's a big literature on this now. There must be dozens of articles. You would know better than I. You've probably kept up with it better than I have, Johnny, and books. But I know there are some so on arguing against me. But there's a big academic debate on this, intellectual debate. But I thought when I wrote that, and he, by the way, took that. He liked the book a lot. He had some comments and criticism, but he thought he didn't change his view on this fundamental issue. He remained a liberal, but he was sufficiently, of course, open-minded and also soaked in counter-enlightenment thinking to some extent, without being a counter-enlightenment thinker himself, that he was open to this argument, and unlike some of his disciples who regarded it as a heresy.
I mean, it's funny that one of the things that does strike me about Berlin and yourself that you seem to have in common is neither of you have generated disciples.
Oh.
And in fact, if there were disciples, both of you would probably try and disassociate yourself from them.
Yes. Well, they usually, that's true. I mean, they usually crudify. I mean, what's attractive in becoming someone's disciple is that it gives you a pattern of thinking that you can then apply without much thought, much thought of your own. And I think that's always a danger. And so I was never inclined. I mean, I was tremendously fertilized by Berlin's thinking, more than I think by anyone else. I also knew Michael Oakeshott, the conservative thinker, and I learned quite a bit from him too, but I was never close to Berlin. Disciplehood appeals to people who like someone else to do their thinking. And so I don't want people like that to be, I don't want disciples of my own, and I don't think Berlin ever sought disciples. He wanted to illuminate the ideas that were prevalent in his time by reference to the history of ideas, and I think I'm very similar to him in that respect. That I follow his method, if you like, of thinking, which was to not treat the existing moment in the history of ideas as somehow definitive or kind of presentism in the history of ideas, but to try and dig into the background and lineage, or as it later came to be called, genealogies of ideas. And that's what he did. And you often find truth or insight in surprising places. So for him, he found quite a lot of truth or insight in counter-enlightenment thought, even though, as I say, he wasn't a counter-enlightenment thinker himself. And I admire that very much in Berlin, because to think that to think that there can't be any insights in de Maistre or Nietzsche or they're dreadful proto-fascists. I'm not going to read. I find that a terribly narrowing way of approaching political thinking or any kind of intellectual inquiry. And so his method is one I adopt, but not his substantive views on a number of things, particularly on the relation between liberalism and value pluralism. But I do share this indifference, or I don't want to create a school, and he hasn't, although his works are still widely studied. I'd say there's no Berlinian school in political theory. Would you agree?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think it's another matter to what extent those who read him remain faithful to, his way of doing things. I think there is a kind of a growing narrowization or specialization, which I think is not true to his spirit.
Oh
But
no, because he was a very well, I mean, that's another thing that's happened in academic life, which is the fragmentation into tiny little disciplines or sub-disciplines. So he was a multidisciplinary thinker, but he used to say multidisciplinary study in the humanities is an orphan subject. Even then, you can't do it very easily. And people say, "Is what you're doing philosophy? Is it political theory?" I don't even answer those questions anymore. I said, read it, call it what you like. I don't give a damn. And I think perhaps less impolitely, that's what Berlin thought. He thought there were certain things which are important to investigate, and that had an indispensable historical dimension. So he was doing something that was partly philosophy and partly history of ideas.
yes, I think for me the thing about that is it's incredibly difficult to do well.
It is.
Whereas it's much easier to do specialized minutiae,
Yes.
and therefore there's a reason why the latter is more prevalent.
Yes.
But anyway, moving on, John. If we move now, going to the 21st century and the beginning of that, your books definitely take on a less academic in form, and they're much more capacious, and they look like they've been written more for the general reader.
They were.
So before we start talking about some of those books, can you recall, how you saw the world at the beginning of the 21st century? What were you think? Were you positive or negative, or what were your views?
Well, I think here there's a sort of biographical aspect of it. I think it was in 2000 or 2001 that my book, Two Faces of Liberalism, appeared. And that was my last intra-academic book. It's a book predominantly written in an academic style and dealing with academic disputes and about value pluralism and different kinds of liberalism, and a critique of the dominant liberalism of that time. And that was, as I say, in 2000. And a few years later, a book appeared, a festschrift for me, called The Political Theory of John Gray, in which a number of academics produced some very interesting and thoughtful critiques of me, and I replied. And so as I was getting into the 21st century, I was increasingly concerned, although I continued to publish some academic papers and so on, but I was increasingly concerned to write in a different way and for a different audience, and a wider audience, as you say. And so that was why, the principal reason why in 2007 I took early retirement from the London School of Economics, where there was, even though there I had a position that involved no teaching and no administration, I did have to, though I did teach, I taught a course of by choice, a course called Liberal Critics of Liberalism, 4 of them, all of whom I'd known: Berlin, Hayek, Oakeshott, and Popper. I thought they were all liberals, and they were also critics of liberalism, so I taught that and I enjoyed it. But by then I was wanting to write for a much wider audience, and I didn't want to have the obligation, which I did of writing some things which were intra-academic. So I left and took early retirement, and I quit and became what I then have since then, 16 years ago, have been, which is a writer. I don't even refer to myself or describe myself as a philosopher, or philosophers now are all professors, and I'm no longer a professor. So I write what I write. Now, in terms of how I viewed the 21st century, I mean, I suppose my book Straw Dogs, which was the one which deviated most radically, both in format and content, from an academic treatise, which came out around about that time as well, kind of shows that, which, as I thought then, as I think now, that Western thought was in the grip of a type of liberal humanism, many aspects of which were displayed a lack of any sense of reality, and they were detached from the way the human world actually operates. And I would say I was either optimistic or pessimistic. I expected the tendencies that were then unfolding, which I'd written about in my critiques of Fukuyama from the 1989 onwards, and which I'd also examined in a geopolitical context in my book, False Dawn, The Delusions of Global Capitalism, which came out in, I think, 1998, which was a sort of partly addressed to academic audiences, but already to a larger audience. I thought that those tendencies would continue to work themselves out. And of course, I couldn't anticipate exactly how the 9/11, the disaster of Iraq, the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008. Moving on then, of course, more recently to Ukraine and now Gaza. I couldn't anticipate all of those in detail, but I thought that the liberal order, not just liberalism as an ideology, but liberalism as a sort of political order in the world, would fragment. And I didn't anticipate either how severe hyper-liberalism or woke would become internally to liberal societies either, but I thought the liberal order would fragment and break up, and that has happened. So, and I think it's still happening. So I haven't been surprised by that. So I suppose I've been able to, while recognizing the many human tragedies that it encompasses, I've been able to adopt that, to observe that process of decomposition of the liberal world with some degree of detachment, because I'm not, in a sense, in the front line. I'm not in the university anymore. But on the other hand, there are enough avenues for free expression open to me and others. There are publishers that will publish you magazines. I write a fortnightly column for the New Statesman. There are places where I can write freely. So we're not living in a totalitarian order. We're not living in a dictatorial order, but we are living in an order in which the freedoms of thought and expression that were taken for granted in the Oxford of Isaiah Berlin, for example, cannot be taken for granted anywhere now, or almost anywhere now. There are enclaves of freedom, enclaves of free expression, which I live in and benefit from and enjoy, and enable me to continue writing. But though in university life and other contexts, there are informal and formal constraints on what you can say, which are not actually imposed by governments. This is how it differs from 20th century totalitarianism, but by the institutions themselves. I mean, it wasn't just the government in Westminster or in Washington that imposes speech codes and trigger warnings and cancellations and deplatforms throughout in universities. It's the universities, the faculties and the students themselves, and other institutions like museums and so on, do the same. So it's actually a different phenomenon from 20th century authoritarianism. And I think that's not fully appreciated, but I've been very fortunate in that, having left university life before this really happened, 2007. There wasn't much sign of it then.
Yes, I mean, that is one of the interesting things you say in your latest book, the New Leviathans, that there is this liberalism, or the Western world, that has its enemies, but you're saying the main reason for its fall is internal, and it's kind of self-imploding. Now, and I think that's fairly clear to anyone that's looking. But one of the things I do want, you seem to be quite pessimistic that this is you think it's kind of irreversible, that you're going to have these enclaves, but they're going to be enclaves. They're not going to widen.
They might survive a long time, some of these enclaves.
They might,
and and some of them might even survive, might even extend their reach in certain contexts for a while. So I'm not ruling that out. But the overall, what might be called liberal civilization, I think is gone. It's over, and can't be brought back because, well, I mean, go on, ask your question.
Yes, I suppose. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think it's in irreversible decline?
Well, there are a variety of reasons, some of them institutional or economic even, and others more fundamental in the sense of cultural or civilizational. I mean, in the academic world, people who are not in the academic world often say, well, it's just a fad that didn't exist 20 years ago and be swept away later on. The academic world, as you will, it doesn't work like that. People appoint their successors. And there's great difficulty of getting into the academic world now if you openly disparage or fail to share the progressive orthodoxy. You won't get in, or you won't be promoted, or you won't get. So I don't see how it's going to swing back as a matter of fashion. It won't. I mean, universities may become the incentive structure of universities is such that it will reproduce this progressive consensus or hyper-liberal consensus, whatever else happens. I mean, let me give you an example. The present government in Britain has brought in some legislation to protect dissidents in academic life from being silenced or decancelled or sacked or deplatformed or whatever. Now, that's useful to those who put their head over the parapet and suffer for it. But it has no effect at all on the majority of academics who conform to the new orthodoxy for career reasons. They'll continue to do it. And because all the internal incentives in the profession point in that direction. You gain nothing by deviating from the current orthodoxies, and you can suffer a lot in terms of your career, which will at least become stationary or maybe even terminated. So that's one reason. That's, if you like, a reason to do with the internal culture or structure of universities. But there are deeper reasons connected with the alterations in Western culture more broadly. I mean, my interpretation of liberalism as it evolved, as you will know from reading my new book, The New Leviathans, Johnny, is that even from Mill, it became a religious rather than just a political position. That's to say, in Mill, adopted from Auguste Comte, the 19th century French founder of positivism, the view that a new religion was needed after monotheism had disappeared or been rejected by large numbers of the intelligentsia. He didn't share the view which cruder Enlightenment thinkers had, which was that religion was just an intellectual error and would die out. He was never so stupid as to think that. Neither was Auguste Comte. So they thought that a new religion was needed, which they called the religion of humanity. And Mill says absolutely explicitly in a passage I quote, the religion of humanity is better than any previous religion that has ever existed. So it is a religion. It's better than all the other religions, and it's the successor to these religions. Now, of course, he also rebounded against Comte's thinking because he thought it was too dogmatic, too systematizing, and too dogmatic. So it was a problem for him as a liberal, canonical liberal, of course, which he remained or tried to remain, to have this religion of humanity from Comte, because in Comte's religion of humanity it was based on science, and science included social science, and Comte thought that social science could prescribe the ends of human life, in other words, values, could not only analyze how society functioned, but could provide solutions to how it could be improved. He thought that ethics could become a matter of expert scientific knowledge. He says this explicitly. Now, that was a problem for Mill, of course, because it meant that the more this knowledge increased, the less of a sphere there could be for his main argument. Mill's main argument for, or one of his main arguments for freedom of expression was fallibility, that we never know. We always make mistakes and so. But if human knowledge can be accumulated in ethics and politics, if they can become sciences like physics or chemistry, which is exactly what Comte said, he invented the word sociology. If the new science of sociology could tell us what was wrong with society and how to fix it, then the room for freedom of thought and expression would shrink as human knowledge advanced. And that was a terrible problem for Mill. He agonized about that a lot. But he did share the view fully that liberal humanism was the successor religion to monotheism, to Christianity in particular. And I think that feature of liberalism has become even stronger with time, and that, for, as I said earlier, it's a faith-based worldview, not a form of empirical thinking, if it ever was, and that means it's very difficult to reform it. It means that it's inherently dogmatic and tends, as I say, to repress opposition, repress criticism, and if it fails in practice, which of course it often does, almost always does in practice with the policy, then the response is not to say, well, we should back off from this. We should. The response, we'll double up. We'll do it more. We'll be more consistent about it. We'll be more pure. We'll be more doctrinally rigorous in applying these liberal and hyper-liberal ideas. So I don't see any way out of it, basically, in the West. There's no. I can't see any way it can be renewed. Now I might be wrong about this, of course, because history moves in strange and unexpected ways. But I think there's no doubt that, and in the meantime, I don't suggest we submit to it. As I've said many times, what we should all be doing is go on practicing this liberal as long as we can, and we shouldn't try and work out who's going to win and try to be on the winning side. We should just do it as long as we can. It doesn't affect my practical life, my as a writer and so on, in that sense. But I can't see a way out of this, and the fundamental reason for that is that liberal humanism is like, in fact, it's like monotheism, Christian monotheism in particular. It's a theodicy. It's an explanation of evil in the world, and it tells its believers that evil in the world might always be there. You might not be able to remember, but it can be reduced over time by doing the right things and thinking in the right way. I mean, they would replace the idea of evil by the idea of ignorance or error. But over time, so in other words, if you like, it's an escape from the nightmare of history, which is a nightmare of essentially of repetition or of recurrence, which is that the same horrors or similar versions of the same horrors that have happened in the past keep recurring. That is history, and that's the way the ancients thought of it. That's the way the Greek and Roman historians thought of it. That's the way the ancient Indians and Buddhists thought of it, and it's the way most of humankind have always thought of it, and that's why humankind has had religions which either say that there is a hidden providence in this history that we can't understand because it's God's intentions, but it's there. So that's one view you can have, or you can have another view which is in some non-Western religions, which is that beyond history there is a possibility of emancipation from history into some other realm of salvation or nirvana. You can step out of history somehow. But but the idea that the recognition, if you like, the acceptance that history is like this, that there's no overall plot or design, that there's no redemptive drama unfolding in it, just a succession of accidents, tragedies, and absurdities is too much for liberals. It would strip their liberal humanists, it would strip their sense of themselves, their lives, of their own importance as well, their vanity, that they can actually resolve these issues in the world. It would destroy that. So they're not going to do it. They'll simply plod on and push on till they destroy the whole thing. And I think that's the problem now, which is that the sense of reality which Isaiah Berlin embodied was unusual among liberals, almost unheard of. Although there was, of course, a generation of liberal reformers after the Second World War who were young enough to have experienced the Great Depression and who successfully defeated Nazism, who were strong enough but pragmatic enough to create a system in which had various built-in checks, at least in part of the world. I mean, they didn't have Hayek and free markets because it's seen what happened in the 30s. They had social democracies, they had government intervention, things that would keep the show on the road. And that kind of pragmatic, if you like, liberalism was strong for a while. But then it weakened as liberalism seemed to get stronger. It weakened as after the Cold War, which the second big totalitarian threat of the 20th century was defeated and collapsed. And that was followed by Fukuyama, and that in turn has been followed by hyper-liberalism, which is a very paradoxical phenomenon in many ways because it's adamantly rejects the liberal West, but at the same time, I think it's a kind of hyperbolic version of some trends, intellectual, cultural, civilizational trends within the liberal West towards ideas of autonomy, towards the idea that when that if monotheism is rejected, what you then go for is a form of humanism in which humans acquire some of the powers, or are believed to have some of the powers of God, including that of creating themselves as they go along with it. And that is an even deeper, of course, illusion, I think, than even Mill's version of liberalism. But I can't say a way out of it. It seems to me to be, and there are lots of other, lots of other contingent reasons to do with unwise wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, which I haven't mentioned up till now, but I should have done because the West was there for 20 years. If it was going to learn something, you would think it would have learned something in 20 years or sooner than that. Didn't learn anything. I've talked to quite a few people who were there as administrators or soldiers and others, and they all said it was a complete fiasco almost from the start, but it went on and on and on. And that's another feature of the liberal West at the moment, which is that it's so detached from reality that it really can't come to grips with it in most cases, and frame policies in which there's an intelligible connection between ends and means, that we'll do this in order to achieve that. And if it doesn't work, we'll modify the policies. As Keynes put it, if the facts change, we'll change our mind. Or if the facts were always different from what we thought they were, we'll change our mind. Those habits of thought. In other words, I think the intellectual capital in the West, the intellectual flexibility in the West, as well as the intellectual discipline and rigor in the West, just isn't there to the extent that it would need to preserve this liberal civilization. I think instead there'll be a long period. I don't know how long. It might be relatively short if there are great wars again, but a period in which there will be these enclaves, but large parts of society will be given over to fragmentation or semi-anarchy, or this kind of strange mix of anarchic fragmentation with intense internal censorship in particular institutions, which is characteristic of our time, not of tremendously, at least in the West, it's not a time of tremendously overbearing governments, I don't think. It's a time of weak governments facing other institutions in society, taking over powers of repression and censorship that governments didn't have in the liberal period.
I mean, that's one thing that seems to me to emerge very clearly from your books. I mean, I'm thinking of the 7 Types of Atheism, then also from Gray's Anatomy, then also from your latest book. What really emerges, there's a kind of pattern there that I think the loss of intellectual nerve has generated a kind of a loss of moral nerve as well. And that shows itself in all sorts of ways. First of all, this detachment from reality, this failure to admit mistakes,
avoidance of reality,
or avoidance of reality, exactly.
Active avoidance.
Yes, and then this inability to learn or admit we've made an error.
But you see, the reason for that is important, Johnny. It's that for the people who believed in the Iraq War or and similar, or Afghanistan, it wasn't just that they had a belief that was false. Their entire worldview is threatened if they admit that it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And that, well, not that it didn't work. They usually, well, if we'd done this, if we'd done that, if we prepared for Iraq better than me. I knew some of the people in Washington who were the architects of the war, and later on, sort of, if they thought for 10 minutes, 10 consecutive minutes about what they would do after the invasion, they wouldn't have invaded. There was big mistakes were made, of course, but the basic conditions and historical background of that state was such that there could never have been a liberal democracy any more than there could have been in Russia. There could have been a better regime in Russia than Soviet communism, and there could have been a better one than Putin, that's for sure, but there couldn't have been a liberal democracy on a Western model. But that means it's not universalizable. It means that that model is not universalizable, and it means that what happens in history, even at the best, is a series of ad hoc adjustments to fending off recurrent evils. I mean, that's my overall formula for politics. Politics is a succession of partial and temporary remedies for coping with recurring human evils. That's what it is. Not a program of universal emancipation, not a model that is approximated in lots of different parts of the world. Not any of these things. It's a success of ad hoc adjustments, coping with the particular evils of the time, and they can't admit that without their whole worldview being collapsing, and that worldview has the same function in their mental life as monotheism did in religious believers. So for them, it's a crisis of faith. They move into despair and dark nights of the soul if this nonsense is threatened. So they can only, as I say in the book, my new book, I mean, when I talk about Hobbes's philosophy of language, they can only make sense of their lives by immersing themselves in nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
If they can only make sense of the world by immersing themselves in nonsense, and there's no way they can. They can retire from the scene. They can become unemployed. They can give up and do other things and so on. But they can't actually shed this. Unless they get perhaps converted to some religion, some traditional religion, which some of them may do or are doing. One or two cases I've come across, but they just can't do it. So there's just not the. It's not just one belief, an empirical belief. If we do this in Afghanistan, that will follow, and it doesn't follow. So then say, well. What they do is they did what Popper used to describe. They immunize their belief, but it's actually more than against falsification. They reframe it so it hasn't been falsified. But that it's not really a belief. It's a system of ideas which has the function of a worldview. And if you destroy that worldview, they're left with no narratives, only events. They're just left with a succession of meaningless events, and that's intolerable. So they won't do it.
Yes. I mean, another word for a sense of reality might be kind of anti-illusionism. But I mean, maybe as we bring this to a close, yes. There's probably two questions I'd like to answer, because one of the things that does come out of your work as well is it's not just anti. There's also, especially in your book Gray's Anatomy, you talk about certain thinkers who can show us the way, including yourself, but people like Berlin, Oakeshott, Velikovsky. But then also novelists like Conrad.
Yes.
And I was particularly taken by your essay in Conrad, Our Contemporary.
Yes, yes.
Maybe a nice way to end this interview would be maybe if you could express what you think makes him worth reading.
Well, he was writing at a time of which included terrorism, one of his great novels, short novels, novellas. Secret Agent is about terrorism, and the terrorist mentality. In The Professor, he puts that in, a terrorist professor. And so that echoes, but more wars, then of colonial wars, but also the Great War, which then came later. Time of terror and war, but also basically a time in which meliorism was being threatened, because the significance of Conrad is that he was not a meliorist. He thought that one should stoically hold to certain values. One should attempt as much as possible to embody them and maintain them. But he did not see human life and the human history as a succession of phases in which things got better. And if you want to see that expressed most overtly, I mean, it's in his great novels and short stories, including one less known called The Outpost of Progress, which I've written about in other contexts. Not only in The Secret Agent and The Heart of Darkness, but also in these short stories. But if you want to see it explicitly explained what he believed, you'll find it in his correspondence with Bertrand Russell, which is collected in Russell's autobiographical volumes, large parts of it, in which Russell is the arch-meliorist. I mean, Russell says if we apply reason to human life, we can improve human life substantially and cumulatively. That's the improvements we achieve at one time or in one generation, we can carry on to the next generation. And I mean, there's a paradox in Hume because he was a tremendous skeptic as well. I mean, he in some ways a disciple of David Hume. So and of course, in David Hume, reason is the slave of the passions. So if what we rely on is reason, then reason will simply enable us to achieve whatever we want, even if that is cruel or destructive or even self-destructive. So there might be a difficulty for. There's a deep difficulty for Russell in that form of Humean rationalism being somehow tied to meliorism, which it wasn't in Hume, actually, because in Hume it resulted in a more skeptical position, which is that one should not disturb the habits and conventions of society insofar as they are functioning and reasonably tolerable. So Hume wasn't a liberal, certainly in that sense. But if you want the stock opposition to meliorism, you get it in Conrad, who says, he said, I don't take any of this seriously. I don't, he says explicitly I don't take any of this argument about this idea of gradually. I take it, human life just isn't like that. There's repeated breakdowns in social orders, there are repeated breakdowns. People are often put in impossible circumstances. And he said, I've never found in any man, he uses this, or any philosophy, anything which I can believe in compared to these recurrent human experiences. So Conrad is a wonderful figure. I mean, in my view, of course, he had Russell's life was adventurous in some ways. He went to Soviet Union and talked to Lenin and so forth, but not in the way that Conrad had been, because Conrad had been a seaman for 20 years. He'd been almost shipwrecked 2 or 3 times. When he was a youth, he'd been gun runner for a while. He had an exceptionally adventurous life. His very way of writing was he wrote in his third language. His first Polish, second was French, and the third was English. So, very unusual man. Russell, by the way, I mean, he almost fell in love with him. He said he called one of his sons Conrad Russell after him, and he said that when I met Conrad, I found that we sank into a deeper region. He said a region almost beneath reason and thought, and we had shared a similar view of the world. Well, to some extent they did, but of course. Conrad had none of these beliefs in meliorism that Russell had, and So you're quite right that I found in some writers, novelists, and so on, nourishment for my own view of my own anti-medialist views, and Conrad is perhaps one of the most important.
Yes. While you were talking there about Russell, I just picked up, it prompted me to remember in one of his essays, Last Perplexities, he says, I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of values.
Yeah.
But I find myself incapable of believing that all that is wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. And that's quite a nice, I think, admission of the tension within his thought.
It is. I mean, if the only thing wrong with cruelty and oppression is that you don't like it, then you could say, well, it's, I don't like black coffee either, so I just stopped. Is it just a taste?
Yes, exactly. And
and also, by the way, implies, doesn't it? Entails, I would say, that you can't persuade people who do like oppression and cruelty not to like it.
Yes, and that's just too much to accept for a lot of people. It says, well, reason has limits, and we don't want to admit that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to finish, if I can, John. The final question, and that would be kind of a desert island disc kind of question. So, if you found yourself marooned on an island, what book, piece of music, and luxury would you bring with you?
Well, I'm afraid my answer is the same one I gave when I was on Desert Island Discs. I haven't changed since then, and that was a few years ago. The book would be a book of poetry by the American poet Wallace Stevens. It's called "The Palm at the End of His Mind." At the End of the Mind, the book is called, but it's a collection of his poetry throughout his entire career as a poet. And I am a great admirer of, lover of his poetry, because he himself didn't have any religious or political beliefs, and one of his poems is called "In Search of in Pursuit of a Supreme Fiction." He thought that we lived by fictions and that they were ephemeral, that they would change over time, that the stories we told ourselves would change over time, and sometimes quite even recurrently in a single lifetime, and he's also a tremendously great poet. So that's the book. The music is some music by Eric Satie, Gymnopody No. 1. I'm a great admirer of Satie. It's light, it's humorous, but it has sort of depth. It's not music that imposes itself on you. It almost kind of tinkles by like a river, but it has depth, as I say, if you listen to it closely. One of his I wouldn't say disciples, but someone very influenced by him, the Catalan composer Federico Montpu. They're both piano concert, it's piano music in both cases. Produced even more sort of, I think, subtle, almost silent music is the title of one of his collections. But I like Satie the most. And finally, on a luxury, I am rather fond of Marmite, so it wakes you up. Its astringency wakes you up, and on a piece of toast. So I think I'd probably be that. So I haven't changed my views on that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
My preferences. They are preferences, not views, actually. I mean, that's they're definitely tastes one has. The taste one has in a book or in music or in food is or luxuries is a taste. So and in those respects, mine have stayed the same.